I'm a freshman here at George Mason. I'm glad I've been able to talk to you and learn a little bit about what you're running for. Why don't
Excellent.
you tell me a bit about yourself and why you're running?
Okay, sure. Now, first of all, I live in Annandale. My wife and I live in Annandale. I'll tell you a little bit about my background and then why I'm running. I've been in the healthcare field for the past 20 years. Um, I actually specialize in electronic medical record systems, and I was an administrator for several companies, especially Kaiser Permanente in Southern California. And I've also worked for the federal government. I've worked for the state government. I've even owned my own small retail business. And when I lived in Los Angeles, I was a reserve sheriff's deputy. I'm retired now from that, and I worked in patrol for about 20 years. So that was my law enforcement background. And I've been an advocate for citizens and families for a long time, especially regarding government legislation and how that legislation affects families. Because a lot of times legislators pass legislation without regard to how it's going to affect families via regulations, via increased taxes, and so forth. I've been talking to a lot of citizens in my district, and I'm highlighting three of the most important issues to them. And that's number one, education transparency and parental rights. We've seen, big problems as far as the parents were concerned in the last couple of years, especially with regard to the lockdowns, because during the lockdowns, some of the parents were able to see what was going on in the classrooms by way of the Zoom meetings that their children were on, and they weren't necessarily that pleased. So many of them attended school board meetings, and they did not feel welcomed. As a matter of fact, there was, probably the most famous case was there was a father who went to a Loudoun County school board meeting because his daughter was sexually molested in the girls' bathroom, and he went there to protest and to make them aware of that. However, they didn't want to hear what he had to say, and he got excited, and he actually was arrested for that. It went through the courts, and he's been exonerated in the meantime. So that's number one. That's parental rights and education transparency. Number two is crime. And again, because I was in law enforcement, I have a particular handle on what's going on. And there's been a huge increase in crime recently. There's a lot of spillover from Washington, D.C. into Virginia. So that's, again, something we need to get a handle on. And I think we'll talk about more about that as we go on in this interview. And number three is high taxes and the high cost of living. I think I also saw some questions in that, so I think we'll go into that in more detail. But the taxes have just gone through the roof here in Virginia for homeowners, for non-homeowners, and that's something that needs to be controlled. It's something that the legislators need to be quite aware of, how legislation is affecting the taxpayers and the citizens in Virginia. So those are my three important issues, and those are really, I'm a citizen legislator. I'm not a career politician. So those are really the reasons that I decided to get into the race.
Perfect. Well, I'll ask you a question off of that. You talked about how you kind of how crime has been on the rise. What exactly would you do to help combat this in certain areas like Richmond and more crime dominant areas?
Yeah. Well, basically what it is the police have been demonized over the past few years, which is really bad. And they've been made out to be the bad guys instead of the criminals. And the police, it's not, citizens versus the police. The police are the protectors of citizens. Citizens are afraid to go out in certain areas because of the crime. And because a lot of police departments and police officers have kind of been handcuffed, so to speak, in what they can do, they don't feel, they're afraid if they're enforcing the law, they're going to get in trouble for that. It's been a very anti-police. There's a lot of anti-police rhetoric out there that has caused this to happen. Also, there are anti-law enforcement district attorneys, such as here in Fairfax County, Discano. And basically, he doesn't want to prosecute crimes, at least a lot of the major crimes. And when criminals are out committing crimes and they know they're just going to be right back out on the street to do it again, and there are going to be no consequences, they're going to continue to commit more crimes and to victimize the citizens. So we need to make sure that DAs, the district attorneys, are prosecuting crimes, even small crimes, because years ago when Rudy Giuliani was the mayor of New York, he had the broken window policy. He said we're not going to let even the petty crimes go by, because that leads to bigger crimes. So we need to start enforcing crimes. In the giant supermarket near my house, they've closed down one of the two entrances to make it, of course, much more convenient for people to get in and out. So you park, you've got to walk way down to the end of the store. And I asked them a long time ago, why? And this is not just my giant, it's like most of the giants. Why are you blocking off one of these doors? And they said, well, because we need to really be able to monitor people as they leave to make sure they're paying for their groceries. So it's something that, again, the citizens are now suffering because of this crime issue. And it's also, we're going to be talking about, I know, inflation and so forth. A lot of this is because of what they call in the retail business shrinkage. There's so many things being stolen from the businesses that increases the prices, and that causes inflation. So, letting petty crimes go unpunished isn't just something that allows the criminals to get away with this kind of stuff. It also makes the citizens suffer. It causes inflation. It causes prices to rise. So those are some of the things that we can do about crime.
Okay, so would you say on the enforcement level, you would support more resources for local areas, stepping a little bit away from the legal side? Would you want to provide more resources to local districts and precincts, and especially like, police, essentially?
Yeah, when you say resources, it's not that we need additional resources. We need to get the police resources up to the level that they should be at. In other words, the police departments are supposed to be at a certain level. Different agencies are different. And right now they're all well below that. It's hard to hire police officers because, again, there's such a negative connotation now to being a police officer. There's been such a demonization of police officers that they're having a hard time recruiting, which means that there are fewer police officers on the street. They're exhausted. They're putting in more hours. And that's also what's led to the fact that there are fewer arrests, especially of criminals, because the police, again, first of all, there are fewer police out there to stop crime. And secondly, if police are arresting people and then the district attorneys aren't prosecuting them, they feel like they're wasting their time. So yeah, we don't need additional resources, in other words, additional tax funds, because we have that already allocated. We just need to be able to make sure that the police aren't being demonized, so that we can hire more people to bring us up to the levels that they should be at.
Okay, stepping away from crime a little bit, or not so much, we have the issue of, obviously, the housing crisis has, you said it yourself, the cost of living has increased a lot, which has no doubt had probably a correlation with the amount of crime that has increased. What would you do to kind of combat this housing crisis?
First of all, we have to look at the reasons why there's a housing crisis. It's basically because the cost of housing has shot through the roof. It's a supply and demand, and right now the supply is getting low because housing is very expensive. And there are many reasons for that. Number one, the taxes, and again, this is something I was going to talk about a little later, but real estate taxes are insane. The real estate taxes have gone up 40 to 50% in the last 5 years. And that's, people, if they bought a house 5 years ago, and a lot of them were kind of strapped when they went to buy their home as it is. And then when they have a huge increase in taxes, and we're not talking about, just a few $100s a year, we're talking about thousands of dollars per year in tax increases. That makes it harder for them to afford a house. It drives the housing prices up. And then if you have, which drives the cost of land. So if somebody wants to build a home, it's very hard to afford that. So again, it cuts the supply, which means that there are fewer homes for people, and they have to move farther away from, for example, Fairfax County so that they can afford a home. So, whenever the government gets involved, it actually makes things worse, not better. There are always unintended consequences. So having the government step in to somehow is going to create more of a problem. They should not be as much involved. They should be lowering tax rates on homes so that people can afford to live in their own homes, and there can be a larger supply.
Well, do you think it's any job of any private industries to kind of help out with this housing crisis, to kind of build more affordable housing and allow more people to move in and allow more, take a more hands-on role in this issue?
Now, how so exactly? How would the private sector be able to do that to create more houses?
Well, I think if first we're able to, like you said, if we cut taxes, we're able to incentivize more private companies, private industries to kind of build more foundations from the ground up, and as you say, increase supply. But I also see a side where if the government is able to incentivize private industries to build more affordable housing and allow for a certain percentage of, let's say, tenants to be in the lower income bracket, it could possibly increase it could possibly lower the cost for, people trying to move in and also help the private industry. And I see it as a benefic a benefit, both sides benefit.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons there is a lack of lower income housing is because it's not affordable to build them because of, again, onerous government regulations. When you build multifamily homes, there are so many regulations that make them so expensive, and increasing regulations. And then if you have rent control, and I know in California they've had this huge problem. When you have rent control and you limit how much money someone can make, then you're going to stop people from building apartment buildings, because if it's a cost benefit analysis. If they look at how much it's going to cost to buy the land to build the apartment buildings, and then how much income they're going to make from that, and they see that they're going to lose money, they're not going to build them. So you've got to make sure you mentioned in incentives. Well, the incentive should be that the government should get out of over regulation, and that alone would create incentives. So rather than having, again, taxpayer money come in, and then you're giving the taxpayer money back to, for example, home builders or apartment builders, that's a vicious cycle that doesn't help anyone, because it's still raising taxes, raising prices. You've got to basically make it easier for them to build and make money. And if there was not rent control in the areas where there was, and all of a sudden apartment buildings are making money, then that's going to incentivize others to build apartment buildings. And then when you have another apartment building coming up, and another, then you have an increased supply. And with the same demand, you're going to have the suppliers saying, okay, what do we need to do to get that business from these people, instead of going to Joe's apartment complex where, and we want to bring them to Mary's apartment complex, we've got to lower prices. So that's what happens. It's basically supply and demand and the free market. That's how you basically increase the housing supply.
Okay, well, we'll move to education a little bit, because you say you talk a lot about education. Obviously, what policies would you specifically support for Virginia schools, and especially even for a little bit of higher education schools here in Virginia?
Again, I would make sure that the parents were in charge. There are policies being put through at the schools from the superintendent of schools, for example, and the parents don't agree with that. The parents should be much more involved in what's going on in the schools and what's going on with their children's education. So that's kind of the main thing. That's one of the things that citizens are outraged over. It's one of the things really that swept Governor Youngkin into office. That was one of his number one issues. And it so resonated with the citizens, especially with families and parents, that, that was one of the things that swept him into office. So that's the main thing. We can't have the school systems deciding what's best for kids instead of letting the parents decide. So that's really the most important thing.
So what would you do at the state Senate level to kind of combat this?
The one thing now, of course, public schools are basically controlled at the county level, but there are some things we can do at the state level and regarding what I was mentioning. For example, Governor Youngkin put out through his Department of Education what are called model policies, which dictates to the school districts throughout the state what they are supposed to do regarding parental rights and many other issues. Michelle Reed, the superintendent of Fairfax County Public Schools, has said, we're not going to obey those model policies. We're going to ignore them because we feel that legally we don't have to. Attorney General Mayorkas has issued an opinion saying, yes, school districts do have to follow those policies, which again give parents primacy in the raising and educating of their children. But again, Michelle Reed and other school district superintendents have done the same thing. They have ignored those. So at the state level, what can we do? The legislature can pass state law. They can pass a parental bill of rights that enshrines and ensures that parents have primacy, and that would be in state law. So that's one of the things we can do in Richmond.
Okay, moving on a little bit more towards, I guess the athletic side of education. There's been a large nationwide kind of conflict and argument for trans athletes in sports. What are your thoughts on trans athletes in sports?
Yeah, now, first of all, I want to make sure we're not conflating transgender rights for adults over 18 with transgender athletes, because again, they're two separate things. Transgender athletes should not be competing with girls in school sports because, facts are facts. Transgender girls that were biological boys have a huge physical advantage over biologic girls. So they should not be competing. It's taking away the rights of girls. And years ago with Title IX, we basically made sure that female athletes in female sports were on the same level as male sports. And now this basically is taking those rights away from females, from girls, because it's saying that now boys can compete in female sports. And that's basically removing Title IX rights that girls got years ago.
Okay. Staying on the education for like one more question.
Sure.
The Virginia Mercury has noted that like a lot of K through 12 schools have been extremely underfunded, resulting in some understaffing. Would you support kind of the more funding of these base level schools?
Most of the school districts, and again, I'm familiar with Fairfax County, that is one of the most highly funded school districts in the country. And funding doesn't necessarily equate to a good education or good outcomes. They have tons of money. The school district needs to pay attention to where that money is going. In addition to the money that the Fairfax County schools get from the state and from county taxes, which again are really confiscatory taxes in Fairfax County, they have put through some bonds in the past few years. The last bond that they put through, they didn't even spend yet, and already they're asking for more money by way of a bond. So the problem is fiscal management, not underfunding. As a matter of fact, one of the current school board candidates was bragging about the money he spent in the Fairfax County schools for money, making, certain buildings better, or really building more modern buildings that are unnecessary, because the buildings we have, for the most part, obviously, if there are buildings that are in disrepair, then those need to be taken care of, and they are being taken care of. But he was bragging about all the money he was spending for this and for that, and it wasn't doing anything to help education. So we need to really put that back on the school districts to make sure they are good stewards of taxpayer money, because again, that's what we're talking about. When we see more funding for schools, we're talking about taking away more money from the taxpayers and using that. So as good stewards of taxpayer money, we have to make sure that the school districts are using that to the best of their ability.
Okay, shifting areas completely, essentially. I want to talk to you about climate change. There's been a rise, obviously, climate change. Some states like California have taken a very dominant role, whether it be incentivizing solar or, mandating electric cars be sold after a certain date. What are your thoughts on climate change, and would you pass any policies relating to it?
Now, what is your biggest concern with climate change?
Well, for climate change, for me especially, I'm more concerned about what could possibly happen with the housing level, with, for example, refugees, not even like out-of-state refugees, but in-state. If sea levels in Florida rise, we're going to have less, quite literally, houses for people to stay in. And I think that could possibly cause an issue, and it could possibly cause an area like Virginia to get more populated and more dense. So I think it could also create a sort of an issue there.
Yeah, they have been talking about that for years. 20 years ago, again, bottom line is, unfortunately, there's been a lot of indoctrination, the whole climate change movement. 20 years ago, they said that parts of New York would be underwater by 2015, and it is now 2023. It hasn't happened. It's not true. Some of the computer models are totally flawed. Back in the 1970s, when you were a couple years old, that's a joke, way before your time, there was an article and a cover of Time magazine that said the coming global cooling crisis. The climate models have been flawed for a long time. And it is not true that there is a problem at all. We haven't seen that. As far as refugees, I know there are some that say, well, there are climate refugees. That's nonsense. There are no climate refugees. They try to blame everything on climate change, but it just isn't true. There's absolutely no causation and no evidence for that. So that's number one. Climate change is one of the, and you're not going to hear this from many people, but it's one of the biggest hoaxes out there, not only in the United States, but worldwide. It has instilled fear into people that have been taught that climate change is a coming crisis. It is absolutely not true. And what is it that is causing climate change? They say carbon pollution. I don't mean to put you on the spot. Do you know what carbon pollution is exactly?
Yeah, it's the burning of usually fossil fuels or, between coal, gas, natural gas. Sometimes natural gas is more efficient, but, just the burning of fossil fuels in general.
But what is carbon?
And cars, obviously.
What is carbon specifically, though?
Well, carbon is a specific compound within, obviously, all of these gases, especially for fossil fuels. It's quite literally called fossil fuels because dead animals die. And after billions or millions of years, they get condensed into some sort of oil that denses their carbon and denses the isotopes of carbon to a more condensed form that can then be burned and used to create energy.
Yeah, I'll tell you, carbon is carbon dioxide. That's what carbon pollution is. Years ago, we had real pollution. If you look at pictures, videos from the 1970s at Los Angeles, you had smog. And in the summertime, you had smog days, what were called smog days, almost every day in the summer. By the mid-afternoon, you could see the smog. It was kind of a brown haze. Your eyes would burn. It was really bad. But cars, fossil fuel burning cars, have cleaned up 99% from what they were. Right now, fossil fuel burning cars are considered PZEVs, practically zero emission vehicles. They are no longer a problem. And in Los Angeles, instead of there being smog days almost every day in the summer, if there's one smog day in the entire year, that's something. Los Angeles is clean, and that's because we don't any longer have a problem. That's real pollution. Carbon pollution is carbon dioxide, and it was never considered a pollutant until I think it was around 2005 when Massachusetts sued the EPA. It's called Massachusetts versus the EPA to call carbon dioxide a pollutant. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, you can call it a pollutant. And that's why they're allowed to call it carbon pollution. Again, don't mean to put you in the spot. Do you know what percentage of the atmosphere and the air we breathe is carbon dioxide?
The percentage of the atmosphere is about 0.05%. It's not a very dominant gas in the atmosphere, but itself is a very dominant compound.
Yes, Caden, that's excellent because most people don't know that. Of that, less than half of 1% of carbon dioxide, which is what we're talking about, only 11% of that, less than half a percent, is man-made. So the fact that we're spending billions of dollars to try to reduce that, it would do nothing. It would do nothing for climate change. And by the way, climate change is not a problem. It's naturally occurring. And what has happened is you have a billions of dollars industry. You basically, it's big climate change. You have companies that are making billions of dollars off of climate change, and there's billions of dollars worth of government funding. So they have a reason why they want to keep this going, why they want to keep climate change going, because they're creating all kinds of electric cars, for example, and so forth. And again, without regard to what effect this has on citizens, because it's our tax dollars paying for all this. So basically, those are my thoughts. We've had a good discussion on climate change, and I think basically that explains where I'm at with it. And follow-up questions, be glad to if you have any on that subject.
Well, I do have a small thing. I know you said climate change is a naturally occurring thing, but I mean, I'm looking at the scientific evidence. There's no doubt that within the last year, it's been or not last, last century or so, it has skyrocketed. The global temperature has increased by 1 degree Celsius, which may not seem like a lot, but it is a lot. And I think even now we are seeing the effects with hurricanes and even a tropical storm in Los Angeles not too long
Hurricanes
ago.
are about 30. The amount of deaths from hurricanes are about 2% of what they were 100 years ago. Did you realize that?
Yeah, I think that's because we've tried to try to mitigate this with more safer regulation.
Yeah, and hurricanes themselves, way less than they were 100 years ago. There are way fewer, but every time there's a hurricane, people say, oh, see, it's because of climate change. But if you look at statistics, we have way fewer violent hurricanes than we had because we're in that period. It's cyclical. And as far as warming and cooling of the globe, what that has to do with is the sun. It's basically the heat source, because the sun isn't a constant heat. It varies. It kind of goes in and out and in and out. And when we have periods of warming, that's because the sun is a little warmer. They used to call it sunspots. And by the way, the last 15 years is actually a period of cooling. We've had cooling in the last 15 years slightly. So those are some of the statistics that are out there. But again, the climate change alarmists don't want you to hear that. They do not want you to hear that. It is we for example, another consequence of this here in Virginia, we have joined California and 16 other states with an electric vehicle mandate, and it states, are you familiar with that? Or
yeah, it's the idea that essentially by a certain amount of time, you have to have an electrical vehicle, or they'll even stop selling
right,
every non-electrical vehicle altogether.
yes, in the states, in the 16 states in Virginia that have signed on to this, by 2035, 100% of vehicles sold in Virginia must be electric. And by 2026, 2 model years from now, so probably you won't even be out of college yet, but when you're out of college and ready to buy a car, by 2026, 35% of all new cars sold in Virginia are supposed to be electric. And number one, the grid can't afford it, can't accommodate that. Number two, electric cars, if you look at the cycle of life of an electric car, they do not make much of a difference over fossil fuel cars. The mining of cobalt and nickel and lithium is very dirty. They're rare earth materials, they're very expensive, and then you've got to dispose of them down the line. So, that's going to be a coming crisis. We just don't have the materials for that. And battery power, you have to charge those. And if you live in a house right now, in a home, a single family home, you can set up for at least $1,000, $1,500 a charging station. And then if you're charging your car at night, yeah, it's going to be cheaper than gas. But if you live in an apartment or if you're out using public charging stations, the electricity is way more expensive. And it is a little more than a gas-powered car. And if the price of fuel comes down, such as it was a few years ago when we were when we had all the energy we needed, didn't have to import any, and the price of energy went down, it was cheaper to own a gas-powered car. So again, these are things that affect citizens. And by the way, the cost of electric vehicles is way higher, and that's with subsidies. And where do those government subsidies come from to pay for electric cars? Taxpayers. So the money we pay to the government, they're giving back to people that are buying electric cars. So again, this is without regard to how it affects the citizens. And that's a prime example.
Well, move on a little bit from climate change. I'll move on to something that very recently happened. The Israel-Hamas conflict, big thing happening. And we've seen the rise, especially in local areas, of a rise of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and creating it with more death threats. How do we ensure that, both Jews and Muslims feel safe and comfortable within the state of Virginia.
Yeah, there's a huge rise in anti-Semitism. That's the problem. There should be no Islamophobia, no anti-Semitism, or anything that, you should not be discriminating or targeting people based on their religion, period. But what is the problem right now? It is not Islamophobia. There is no Islamophobia. It's kind of a myth. And again, if it happens, it's got to be stopped. But right now, we have anti-Semitism not only throughout the country, but throughout the world. And this is the big problem. For those who are students of World War II and the Holocaust, this, people kind of closed their eyes to it back then until after the war, and then they realized what had happened. Well, it's happening again. We have had protests, anti-Israeli, anti-Jewish protests throughout the country and throughout the world. And this was, and it's unbelievable to me, because what happened is Hamas attacked Israel civilians. 1,400 Israeli civilians were murdered on October 7th. And now there are protests throughout the country and the world against Israel. So it's just unbelievable to me. There are protests, even last night in DC, in New York, and across the country and across the world, in London and Paris. Excuse me. There were calls during the protest in Washington, D.C. last night, death to the Jews. There was violent anti-Semitic graffiti pasted all over Washington, D.C. Death to the Jews, death to Israel, and so forth. This is the problem, and this has got to be stopped. A lot of it, I hate to say this again, but it has to do with indoctrination in the schools from when kids are in public schools. There was a poll, a Harris poll out last week, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago. It was quoted in the New York Times, and it said that for adults 65 and older, the question was Hamas justified in going into Israel and killing 1,400 civilians in a brutal way, killing, raping, kidnapping 200, beheading them, burning babies? It was unbelievable, the atrocities. But again, back to the poll, 65 and older, 9% said that Hamas was justified. 55 to 64 said, 11% said Hamas was justified. But when you get down into 18 to 24-year-olds, 51% said that Hamas was justified to commit these atrocities against Israelis and the Jewish people. So there's a problem there. Why is it that young people have been indoctrinated to feel this way? It's just horrendous. And that's what we have to do something about right now. Again, there should be no discrimination against anyone based on religion. But right now, the problem is anti-Semitism, and that has got to be stopped. We need politicians to speak out against that and to say we will not allow this.
Okay, well, kind of going off that note, I mean, would you agree with I think this is a great example that has happened, not in this state, but I've seen it in other states. There's been death threats created against, Jewish communities, synagogues, and
Oh, I don't know if you can hear me, Caden, but you froze.
Yeah, I think Caden is having some connection issues right
Oh no!
So let's just
Man,
give
we're
him a
about to
minute.
get into a good question.
I
Oh,
know,
there it is.
right?
I see. Okay, Caden, we lost you for a second. We'll have to have you restate that question. Oh, he's frozen
Oh,
again.
Caden, can you hear us? I think he's still. There he is. Caden, can you hear us? You're
yes, I
muted,
I must have disconnected, it looks like.
All right. So yeah, can you go back to that last question and ask that again?
Yeah, so I was going to ask, basically, with police resources, would you support police resources or more police protection for, Jewish communities and Islamic communities, especially when they're trying to practice religion, when they've received threats from other communities against their, synagogues? Would you protect more police protection and more police resources to kind of look out for them?
Absolutely. The First Amendment in the United States, part of that is freedom of religion and freedom to worship how you want. We do not have an established religion in the United States. So we have to make sure and protect people that want to practice their religion. And right now, again, with the anti-Semitism, we have to do what we can to protect the Jewish people. And if there were threats against mosques and against Muslims, then we need to do the same thing. It cannot be tolerated in the United States that people are out protesting and calling for, death to Jews, death to Israel, and anything like that, and for any religion. So that is going to be number one in protecting our citizens.
I know we're a little bit short on time, so I'll just ask you one final question. Since you're running as a candidate, would you support any type of election reform inside of Virginia?
Yeah, I mean, I would make sure to examine that very closely to make sure that First Amendment rights are not being infringed, because part of being able to donate to candidates, I mean, that's a First Amendment right. If you believe in a candidate and you believe what that candidate is saying and you want to support them, then you should be able to support them. However, there's a huge disparity in the amount of money that's coming into certain candidates. I'm a challenger. If you look at my donations, they've all come from individuals, from citizens. If you look at some of the incumbents, the citizen donations are way at the bottom of the list of the money that has been donated to their campaign. They have huge corporate donations, and and in Virginia, it's unlimited the amount of money you can donate. So there's such a disparity. If you have incumbent politicians, it's very difficult to challenge them, and that's sort of an anti-democratic, anti-democracy, issue. When you have, again, $1 million, $2 million from one politician, and then the challengers can only raise, $10, $20, $50,000. So another thing we've got to look at closely, and this has to do with ethics, is if corporations are donating to politicians, we have to see how those politicians are voting to make sure they're not favoring those corporations. So that's one thing. The issue of a casino, the companies that are trying to promote and build this casino have donated a lot of money to my opponent. I'm not saying there's anything going on here. There's any favoritism or crime, but again, it's an example of the things we need to look into. If they're donating to incumbents and they think those incumbents are going to win, and they're giving thousands of dollars to an incumbent, then obviously they're going to expect some kind of at least the door's open for them to be able to speak to the incumbents and try to convince them that their corporations need help at the state level. So yeah, I would be for reform. I want to look at that very closely.
So you would pose sort of like more donation reform on how many. I mean, I know the case is Citizens United v. FEC of, I think, 2013. So would you support any sort of legal challenges to that could possibly rise through the bracket of district and Supreme Courts?
Well, no, I wouldn't challenge that in the Supreme Court. That's national law, and I think it was actually a good decision. But at the state level, for state politicians, we can make those decisions here in Virginia. So that would be done in Richmond to determine. Again, every state, for their state elected officials, have different laws, different campaign finance laws on how they do things. Some states don't allow any corporate donations for state legislator races. So yeah, at the state level, I would want to look at that, at campaign finance reform, possibly. Again, I'd have to examine it very closely to make sure we weren't infringing on First Amendment rights.
Okay, perfect. I think we're just about out of time, if I'm correct. I don't know if you have any more time left to ask more questions.
I'm actually over. I had another appointment, but no, this was worthwhile. I'm glad we had a chance to talk and speak on the issues.
Well, I'm glad you could come here. We could share your ideas with all the Mason students here, and I'm thankful for this opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Caden. Take care.